One person who has a pretty unique perspective for this campaign is the former member for the Western Sydney seat of Parramatta. Ross Cameron served in the Howard government for 3 terms, including as Parliamentary Private Secretary until 2004. He then moved to business with 4 years at Macquarie Bank, and he's now Executive Chairman of Town Cars, which competes with the taxi industry. Ross Cameron, welcome to Late Line Business.
Thanks, Tiki.
You said in a recent opinion piece that unionists attach too much weight to work choices as a factor in the 2007 result. Work choices have been front and centre today. Can Tony Abbott shake it off?
Look, I think this is, I feel like a massive yawn in relation to today's sort of beat-up. If you get a copy of Tony's book, Battle Lines, which I would recommend, he said, a year ago, he said that work choices was a catastrophe for Howard. Abbott, in characteristic, direct, honest language, listed a range of the Howard government's failures and mistakes, and at the absolute top of the list was the excesses of work choices. Out of 22 cabinet ministers, there was one clear voice opposing the removal of the no disadvantage test, and that was Abbott.
Well, the Union and the Labor Party, on current form, obviously think this is a very good line of attack. Tony Abbott today says work choices are dead, buried, cremated, and he's signing documents on radio. And then we hear also that the laws are tweakable, and Tony Abbott again says he can't give it a guarantee on all the IR legislation. Isn't that an unfortunate delivery of the message?
Well, Tiki, there would be, I imagine, 1,000 separate pieces of legislation governing the Australian workplace. It's actually a scandal how much law there is. There's a massive industry of labour lawyers generating more of it. And the idea that Tony could give an undertaking that not one sentence of one bill would change over a 3-year period sounds to me like eminently sensible.
What about the traction that this might have in your old electorate, for example, among ordinary people and small businesses?
Well, look, all I know is that when John Howard was elected in 1996, unemployment in the electorate of Parramatta was about 14% and youth unemployment was about 20%. And as a consequence of a pro-business, pro-market, more laissez-faire approach, we had the most rapid growth, not just in jobs, but in real wages, much more rapid growth in real wages under Howard than we saw under Keating or Hawke or Rudd. So I hope that whoever is the Prime Minister can produce that kind of outcome. The big question on industrial relations is not to do with Tony Abbott. It's to do with what does Julia Gillard now owe to the Feeneys and the Foleys and the Arbibs of this world, the faceless men who most Australians have never heard of, who decided they didn't like Australia's choice for Prime Minister at the last election and they would install their own. And the question Julia Gillard needs to answer is how much more deeply will she work to entrench the trade union in small businesses in Australia, and what does she owe to those faceless men who took her hand and plunged it between the ribs of Kevin Rudd?
Well, today, and the last 2 or 3 days, she's been very much on message, talking about going forward, and it was something that actually Peter Costello mocked today. He said every time Labor gets into power, aren't they unlucky? The budget goes into deficit and debt, and they get whacked by international circumstances, poor things. But why is it that Labor haven't been able to get their message across, a message about low unemployment, you mentioned low unemployment, and about being the envy of the world after the GFC?
Well, look, I think it's because in their heart of hearts, most Australians don't really believe that the Labor Party either understands or has a deep interest in the creation of wealth. And this, if we go to the big picture question facing the Australian people or the business community, is that the problem for Labor is they see the role of government as the redistribution of wealth. That's the principal philosophical commitment, is that the way you achieve greater equality is to redistribute wealth by force, by governments, taken from one group and giving to another.
That was very much their message about the mining tax, wasn't it?
That's right. And the mining tax sort of crystallised that sense people had that there is a lack of and it's a natural thing that lack of understanding should be there, because if you go from one end of the Labor caucus to the other and look for one person who has ever invested $1 of their own money to create wealth or to encourage investment and employment, you could be looking across the Tanami Desert, to find a sole living, breathing capitalist in their midst. And so they see government as the opportunity to square the ledger and to redistribute wealth, whereas those on the coalition side are much more instinctively the sort of the shopkeepers and the small business people, the bed and breakfast owners who have a sense that creating wealth involves risk.
Well, let's talk about mining for a moment, because that redistribution was supposedly going to go to those small business, among others. You said in June that the mining industry was having its John Galt moment, which will appeal to Ayn Rand fans, I'm sure. But did mining come out on top in its battle with government?
Well, certainly the government did get rolled by the big miners. And frankly, I was cheering for the big miners, because I think the idea that you take the most productive, wealth-creating, employment, investment-attracting industry and you just put a massive lump of lead in its saddlebags when capital is a very mobile commodity that moves between countries with a great deal of ease. The idea that you're going to hamstring Australia's most productive industry is, I think, an act of negligence.
So how do you analyse the recasting of budget figures last week, the $7.5 billion difference?
Well, either way, you've got to say that Tom Albanese and, Marius Kloppers did, and Twiggy Forrest did a pretty good deal. And whatever they spent on the advertising campaign, their shareholders derived a very significant benefit from it. But I say, fair enough. Their shareholders shouldn't have been getting hit in the way that they were. 40% movement from a royalty-based tax to a profit-based tax is an entirely rational and appropriate thing to do. It's just a massive slug that came out of nowhere. And I think that's the 40% that would have moved Olympic Dam, which is really the hope of the side for a state like South Australia, one of the great resource projects anywhere on the planet. And Labor looked like either completely destroying it or at least delaying it for a generation.
Well, we've just seen in the story earlier that business is now looking for long-term reform to deal with a commodities boom on the one hand and a financial crisis on the other. What do you read into that? Some kind of tax reform?
Well, look, we've seen, Mr. Treasurer Swan's idea of root and branch tax reform, which someone observed looked more like the trimming of a twig, as it finally turned out. The truth is this has been a government which is incredibly tepid when it comes to real reform, unlike, we should say, the Hawke era, unlike the Howard era.
So you would push for further reform, and would that involve, for instance, a cut in corporate tax rates?
Well, look, I think we should be cutting taxes wherever we can. And
do you think Tony Abbott would be up for that this election?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm not going to preempt Tony's announcements, but I think what you can look to, and electors have this problem at every election, that you are sort of taking a leap of faith, and there is always this gap between what people promise and what they deliver. So the question is, well, how do you fill the gap? And the best way to fill it is to look at the actual track record of the protagonists when they were in government. Now, Julia's going forward or moving forward regime is partly Julia saying to the Australian people, look, please close your eyes and forget everything we've done over the last 3 years. Forget, the education revolution. Forget pink bats. Forget the ETS. Forget
Ross
all
Cameron,
the things we've ballsed up.
I'm going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for talking to Late Line Business.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks, Tiki.